Trash. Captain Mark whispered the word not to describe the unfortunate victim sprawled across the pool of black water at his feet, but to refer to the tiny speck of mud, no bigger than the head of a toothpick, that had splashed onto the toe of his gleaming Italian leather shoe. At the scene of the mysterious murder, reeking of sewage and rot from the harbor, Mark stood there like a god who had wandered into hell or a stone statue carved out of arrogance. His custom charcoal gray suit was impossibly immaculate, not a single wrinkle, hugging his athletic frame. His hair was meticulously groomed, every strand in place, and his handsome face was frozen, showing no emotion except a tightly restrained disgust. "Captain, we found traces of the ghost gang," Sergeant David said, his body smeared with mud from head to toe, stepping closer with a cautious voice. "It looks like an internal purge after last week's failed deal." Mark frowned slightly, not because of the news, but because David was standing too close. He pulled a pristine white silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, lightly covering his nose, and stepped back exactly one pace, the proper hygienic distance. "Stay right there, David. Your sweat is contaminating the air around me," Mark said, his low voice sharp as a scalpel. "And don't use words like, looks like. There is no room for speculation in my dictionary." David swallowed and bowed his head. "Sorry, sir. But the scene is too chaotic. They left no fingerprints, and there are no witnesses." "No witnesses?" Mark scoffed, a smile that never reached his eyes. He stepped past the yellow tape, the toe of his expensive shoe gliding over the filthy ground as if he were floating. He pointed at the bruised wrist of the unfortunate victim. "Look. Figure 8 rope marks. Only old dock sailors at the East Harbor still use that kind of knot. And look under his fingernails, blue powder residue. Industrial paint used on the containers from the shipment that arrived this morning." Mark turned back, his razor-sharp gaze drilling into David, who stood there dumbfounded. "He was killed in warehouse number 4, then dragged here. The killer is left-handed and walks with a limp. Now tell your team to move this unfortunate corpse and bring the perpetrator to me before dinner. I refuse to breathe this contaminated air for one more second." The surrounding officers looked at him with a strange mix of emotions, fear of his extraordinary intellect, and hatred for his obsessive cleanliness and brutally superior attitude. Mark knew it. And he enjoyed it. The loneliness at the top was his addiction. Mark left the scene and got into his jet-black sports car, spotless, not a speck of dust on it. He immediately used disinfectant to wipe his hands 3 times before touching the steering wheel. To Mark, criminals were not misguided humans in need of redemption. They were bacteria. Stains that ruined the perfect picture of social order he ruled over. And his mission was to cleanse them not out of compassion, but because he could not tolerate filth. The private elevator doors opened, carrying Mark into his top-floor penthouse. The contrast was blinding. If the outside world was chaos and grime, this place was a sterile laboratory. The apartment was vast, white, and cold. No excess furniture. No personal photographs. Not a trace of human warmth. Mark took off his shoes and placed them neatly into a glass display cabinet which he valued more than a safe. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood watching the city glitter below through the thick, soundproof glass. 6 years. It had been 6 years since Sarah left. "You're not human, Mark. You're a machine programmed to chase perfection. I can't live inside your glass display case forever." His wife's final words still echoed somewhere in this empty home. But Mark curled his lips and brushed them aside. She was too weak. She didn't understand that to maintain order, one must eliminate emotion. Her departure, in a way, had been a release. It helped him remove complicated emotional variables and focus entirely on his career. He stepped toward the transparent glass board in the center of the room, covered with diagrams of the ghost gang and the missing persons case that had dragged on for half a decade. This was the only stain on his 100% perfect clearance record. "You think you can hide forever?" Mark muttered, his fingers sliding lightly over the glass, right where the circled face of gang leader Jack was marked in red. "I'll find you. Not because I pity those brats. But because you're dirtying my record. I'll find you if. I'll find you He drained his glass, his eyes flashing with a pathological sense of possession. He didn't need to save the world. He only needed to win. And to win, he was willing to trample anything in his way, whether emotions or compassion. The phone rang, shattering the deathly silence. A message from an informant. Jack has been located. The Rusty Spoon, the 9th Ward. Mark set the glass down and adjusted the collar of his suit. The hunt began. He had no idea that his trip to the filthiest place in the city that night would mark the beginning of the collapse of the perfect monument he had so carefully built. The stench of burnt grease mixed with the damp smell of peeling walls slammed into Mark's nose like a punch. For a man who had just stepped out of a sterile penthouse, the cheap eatery buried deep in the projects was nothing less than an open landfill. Mark sat at a table in a dark corner with a clear view of the entrance, the only seat he would accept after using half a pack of antibacterial wipes to clean the tabletop and chair. He didn't order food. He simply sat there, motionless like a sculpture placed in the wrong setting, gripping his own water cup, wearing a tiny earpiece transmitting static-filled sounds from the support team outside. "Target Jack hasn't shown up yet, Captain. Are you sure he'll come to this rat hole?" David's voice crackled through the earpiece. Mark lightly touched his ear, eyes still locked on the entrance, lips barely moving. "He's a sewer rat, David. And sewer rats always return to trash. He'll come. Don't bother me with stupid questions again. And Inspector Bovitions, problements, the ... up to, NBI, DMA, AM. He cut the connection and glanced at his watch. His patience was being tested not by time, but by the surrounding filth. The noisy working-class diners, the sloppy chewing, the crude clatter of bowls and chopsticks stretched his nerves taut like wire. Just then, a small, thin figure passed through his field of vision. It was a little girl serving tables, about 7 or 8 years old. But Mark didn't see a child. He saw a moving pile of chaos. Her long hair was greasy and matted, as if it hadn't been washed in months, hanging down to cover most of her face. Her oversized clothes were filthy, reeking of the sour stench of spoiled leftovers. "Make way. Hot soup coming," the owner shouted from the kitchen. The girl staggered, carrying a tray of soup far too large for her scrawny body. Her bare feet, black with grime, slid quickly across the slippery, grease-covered floor. Mark frowned and instinctively pulled his leg back to avoid contact. But cruel fate always knows how to strike at perfectionists. As she passed Mark's table, the girl seemed to lose her strength. Her foot caught on the edge of a chair. Her whole body lurched. Crash. The piercing crash of a bowl shattering rang out, followed by a deadly silence that enveloped the entire diner. A bowl of thick, steaming tomato soup came crashing down. Not onto the floor, but onto Mark's $3,000 shoes, the very pair he had polished until he could see his reflection in them before leaving home. Time seemed to freeze. The dark red liquid flowed along the toe caps, seeping into the exquisite leather, dripping steadily onto the filthy floor. Steam rose, carrying the stench of cheap spices straight into his nostrils. Mark did not scream. He did not jump back like an ordinary person. He simply rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate yet radiating a terrifying threat. The air around him seemed to drop below zero. The restaurant owner rushed out in a panic, his face drained of color when he saw Mark's designer suit. "Oh my God. I'm so sorry, sir. That girl is so clumsy. She's mute, so she's slow. I'll get a rag." "Shut up." The 2 words left Mark's mouth softly, yet razor-sharp, slicing through the man's pleas. He raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Mark lowered his head, looking at the shoes being executed by the disgusting stain. Then he lifted his gaze, his eyes as cold as a scalpel drilling straight into the trembling child at his feet. There was no compassion in Mark's eyes. No tolerance for a child forced into labor. Only utter disgust. To him, the child was the embodiment of chaos, a bacterium, a piece of trash that had dared to violate his perfect territory. The child shrank back, curling into herself, both hands clutching her head. But Mark did nothing. Instead, he pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket. Everyone thought he would hand it to the child to wipe her hands or clean the shoes. But no. Mark used it to cover his own nose, as if the child's very existence were an unbearable stench. "Do you know how much these shoes are worth?" Mark asked, his voice flat, emotionless. The child shook her head frantically, her entire body trembling, her mouth producing panicked, inarticulate sounds. "They're worth more than your miserable life," Mark said, each word hammered into the air. He did not accept apologies. He needed order restored. He needed the stain erased immediately by the most submissive means possible. Mark pointed his long, immaculately groomed finger at the ground, right in front of the soup-covered toe of his shoe. He did not offer a napkin. He did not call for help. He issued a cold, cruel command that stripped the child of the last shred of dignity she had. "Clean it." The entire diner held its breath. The child lifted her eyes, hidden beneath tangled hair, staring at him in shock. Mark stared down at the stain, his gaze cold enough to freeze the air. "Don't even think about leaving until these shoes are as clean as they were before." His words were gentle, but they carried the weight of 1,000 tons. Overwhelmed by the man's oppressive presence, the child trembled and instinctively dropped to her knees in a desperate bid for survival. She did not dare ask for a cloth, hurriedly using her torn sleeves and tiny fingers, desperately trying to wipe away the stain. The restaurant owner swallowed hard, stepping forward to intervene, but froze under Mark's icy stare. Mark watched intently as the small hands moved over the expensive leather. The sensation of filthy fingers touching his shoes made his skin crawl with revulsion, but he forced himself to stand still. This was punishment. However, something was wrong. Mark frowned. The child was not cleaning in a normal way. She was not scrubbing hard to remove the stain. Instead, her stiff, calloused thumb was pressing firmly against the toe of his shoe. Tap. 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 She moved her finger in strange, broken rhythms. She dragged her nail across the leather, leaving deep impressions, then stopped, then pressed again. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark snapped impatiently. "Clean it, not scratch my shoes to pieces." The child seemed not to hear him. She kept her head bowed, her mouth producing meaningless sounds. The sound was like the whimper of a wounded animal, but also like a desperate attempt to say something her throat could not form. Her hands moved faster, frantically pressing, dragging, carving chaotic marks into the leather. Mark clicked his tongue, irritation reaching its peak. He assumed the girl was not only mute, but intellectually disabled, destroying his property instead of cleaning it. "Enough!" Mark shouted, jerking his foot back. The child lost her balance and collapsed onto the floor. But she immediately scrambled up again. This time, she looked up. Her hair hung in greasy strands, but through the gaps, Mark caught her eyes wide open, blazing, locked onto him. They were not eyes of fear or remorse. They were eyes of heart-rending desperation. The child suddenly lunged forward. She did not run away. She charged toward Mark. Her hands, smeared with soup and dirt, reached out, trying to grab the perfectly pressed, spotless hem of his trousers. Her mouth opened wide, struggling to scream a clear sound, but only a rasp escaped her throat. Mark's obsession with cleanliness surged violently. He saw the filthy fingers about to touch his pants as if they were plague-ridden viruses attacking him. "Get away from me!" Mark screamed, recoiling as if burned. His extreme cleanliness reflex took over. He yanked his leg back and violently shoved her away to prevent her from touching him. The sudden force from a grown man sent the small, fragile body stumbling backward. A dull thud echoed as her back slammed into a table leg. The child curled up, clutching the arm that had taken the impact, but her eyes remained locked onto Mark, one last look filled with despair, pain, and disappointment. Mark brushed off his pant leg aggressively, even though the child had never managed to touch it. He exhaled sharply, adjusted his suit jacket, feeling disgust crawl over his body. "Never," Mark pointed at the child lying on the floor, his voice icy and cruel, "never let those trash-filled hands touch me again." At that moment, his earpiece crackled with David's voice. "Boss. Target Jack just appeared in the back alley. He's moving. Mark instantly switched modes. He spun around, not sparing the child a single glance. In his mind, the incident was over. He had taught the street trash a lesson about their place in society. I'm on my way, Mark said into the earpiece, striding toward the door, leaving behind the child struggling to her feet and slipping back into the darkness of the kitchen like a rat afraid of the light. Mark stepped outside the diner, inhaled deeply, feeling satisfied. He had no idea that on the toe of his shoe, that mentally disabled child had left behind a message more important than life itself, a message he was about to decipher with his own hands, one that would tear his heart into 100 pieces. Mark's office at the police station was bathed in cold white LED light, in stark contrast to the chaotic night outside. He slammed a stack of files onto the desk, the sound of paper hitting wood cracking sharply. He got away again, Mark snarled, loosening his tie, his eyes bloodshot. Jack vanished right under our noses because of some little brat, ruining the ambush. Remen. Sergeant David stood by the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, hesitating before stepping inside. Sir, Team 3 is re-sweeping the area. He might not be far. Do you want something to drink? Do you think caffeine fixes incompetence? Mark snapped, turning sharply, his gaze dropping to his shoes. The soup stain had dried, forming a hard crust on the toe. It looked like a grotesque scar on a perfect work of art. Throw it away, Mark ordered with disgust, sitting down and beginning to remove the shoe. This pair of shoes died the moment that filthy little girl touched it. David hurriedly set the coffee down and moved closer to pick up the shoe. Yes, sir. I'll take care of it right away. Wait. Mark suddenly raised his hand to stop him. As the harsh desk lamp shone at an angle across the toe of the newly removed shoe, an abnormal detail jumped out at him. To an ordinary person, they were nothing more than messy scratches made by fingernails. But to Mark, obsessively devoted to order to a pathological degree, he recognized that these scratches followed a pattern. They were not random. Give me the magnifying glass. Now, Mark said, his voice dropping, shifting from anger to the intense focus of a hunter. David fumbled through the drawer and handed it to him. Mark pulled on a pair of rubber gloves and lifted the shoe to eye level, as if dissecting a corpse. He examined closely the spots where the leather had been pressed deeply by the child's fingernails. Do you see anything, David? Mark asked, his gloved finger hovering in the air, tracing the path of the scratches. David squinted. Just scratch marks, sir. The kid was probably panicking and clawing at random. Wrong. Look carefully. These are deliberate presses, Mark murmured, cold sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. One short mark. Another short mark. A third short mark. Then 3 long marks. Then 3 short marks again. He jerked his head up, staring at David with wide, shocked eyes. 3 short. 3 long. 3 short. Did you go to the police academy just to decorate the uniform? What is this? David froze, stammering. SOS. A distress signal? Exactly. Mark slammed the shoe down on the table, his breathing starting to quicken. That girl isn't mute, and she isn't mentally impaired. She was signaling right under my nose. She pretended to clean my shoe to transmit a message. Mark felt a jolt of electricity run down his spine. Not out of compassion, but because he realized he had missed a crucial clue in the case. He had allowed his prejudice against filth to cloud his razor-sharp logic. But there's more. Mark bent down to examine the final part of the Morse sequence. Right after the SOS signal, there was a crude drawing carved deeply with a fingernail, etched into the expensive leather. What is that? David leaned in curiously. Mark narrowed his eyes. A star, he whispered. A 5-pointed star. But it was not an ordinary star. The lines were crooked and trembling, and most notably, the third point of the star was broken, bent downward in a strange way. Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed through Mark's head. That distorted star image triggered something deep in his memory. A powerful wave of recollection crashed over him, leaving him dizzy. He had seen this star somewhere before. He was certain of it. "Sir? Are you okay?" David asked anxiously when he saw Mark, clutching his temple. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to search through the vast library of case files in his mind. Was this the symbol of the ghost gang? Or a tattoo belonging to some criminal he had arrested before? The broken third point. Why did it feel so painfully familiar? I've seen it, Mark said hoarsely, trying to push away the headache pounding through his brain. It's in an old file. It has to be. He brushed aside the strange nausea churning in his stomach. His psychological defense wall was too thick. It prevented him from connecting that image to anything related to personal emotion. Mark believed this was a clue leading to the criminal's hideout, an internal code of theirs. David. Mark shot to his feet, his eyes blazing with competitive fire. That girl is not just some ordinary street kid. She's a victim or a critical link they're trying to control. She's asking for help. So what do we do? Go back to that diner? David asked. Not just go back. Mark grabbed his coat, his usual cleanliness and rigid order vanishing, replaced by predatory instinct. Pull every security camera within a 500-meter radius of those projects. I want a clear look at that girl's face. I want to know why she knows that distorted star symbol. He looked down at the shoe once more, the piece of evidence he had nearly thrown in the trash. I'll find you, Mark muttered, clenching his fist. If you dared to leave scratches on my shoe, then you'd better have answers worthy of me. Mark stormed out of the room, leaving David scrambling after him. He was furious with himself for letting a witness escape. Furious over a professional oversight. He had no idea that the headache he just experienced wasn't from work stress, but the scream of his subconscious trying to awaken someone who had been asleep in emotional numbness for 6 years. The tech room was submerged in darkness, lit only by the blinking blue glow of a massive computer screen reflecting off Mark's tense face. He stood with both hands braced on the desk, his heavy breathing blowing down the back of Miller's neck, the technician, drenched in sweat. Hurry up, Miller, Mark tapped his finger on the desk, the steady sound like the ticking of a time bomb. My patience has limits, and you crossed them 5 minutes ago. I'm doing everything I can, Captain, Miller stammered, fingers flying over the keyboard. The diner's cameras are too old, low resolution, and backlit. The mud on the subject's face obscures most identifying features. I don't care about reasons, Mark cut in coldly. Run the noise reduction algorithm. Strip away the mud layer. Increase the contrast. I want to see her eyes. I want to know who carved that damn symbol onto my shoe. Miller swallowed. Yes, sir. Processing. I'll rewind to the moment when you knocked the subject down. On the screen, grainy black and white footage appeared. Mark saw himself tall, arrogant in his perfect suit. And beneath his feet was the girl. Small. Ragged. The video reached the moment when the girl looked up after falling. Stop. Mark shouted. Zoom in on her face. Right there. The pixelated image gradually sharpened under image processing technology. The girl's face emerged from the darkness and suit. Her eyes stared straight into the camera. But Mark wasn't looking at her eyes. His gaze was locked onto a tiny detail beneath her chin, where the mud had been slightly washed away by tears. A scar. Crescent-shaped. Clang. The glass in Mark's hand fell to the floor and shattered. The piercing sound ripped through the silence of the tech room, making Miller jump. Captain? Miller turned around, panicked when he saw his boss's face drained of all color. Sir, what's wrong? Mark didn't answer. He staggered back a step, clutching his head with both hands, his breathing turning ragged like someone about to drown. The world around him reeled and spun. That crescent-shaped scar. It was like a rusted key being forced into a lock of memory that had been permanently sealed in his mind. A surge of electricity shot down his spine, blowing open the door to the past. Dad! Look at me. The high-pitched voice of a 2-year-old girl rang inside his head. Clear as day. Memories flooded back like a raging torrent. Mark saw himself 6 years earlier, standing in the living room, phone in hand, absorbed in a case. Wait a minute, Emily. Daddy's busy, the Mark of the past snapped, his eyes never leaving the iPad screen. Little Emily ran toward him, tripped over the rug, and her chin slammed hard into the sharp edge of the glass table. She screamed in pain. Mark threw the phone aside and rushed to hold his daughter. The wound healed, leaving a crescent-shaped scar beneath her chin, the scar he used to kiss every night to apologize for his neglect. Mark staggered, gripping the edge of the desk tightly to keep himself from collapsing. It wasn't over yet. The image of the distorted star on the toe of his shoe surfaced again, overlapping with another memory. An autumn park 6 years ago. Daddy, I drew it wrong, Emily whimpered, holding up a chalk drawing on the pavement. A 5-pointed star, but the third point was always broken, bent downward because her little hands were still clumsy. The Mark of that day had smiled, ruffled her hair. It's okay, princess. This is a star just for you and Daddy. As long as I see it, I'll know it's you. No matter where you hide, Daddy will find you. Our star. No matter where you hide. The brutal reality crashed down on Mark like a 1,000-pound sledgehammer. The child in the diner. The filthy, stinking child he had scornfully called trash. The child he had forced to kneel and clean his shoes. The child he had shoved away, sending her sprawling across the floor. That wasn't a stranger. That was Emily, his biological daughter. The child he had searched for in desperate madness for 6 long years, the child whose loss had turned him into a cold, unfeeling machine just to survive the pain. With his own hands. With his sick obsession with cleanliness, he had crushed his daughter's plea for help. She had tried to speak to him. She had carved their star onto his shoe. She had tried to touch him. And what had he done? Get away. Don't let those trash-filled hands touch me. His own words echoed back, tearing his heart to shreds. He had called his daughter trash. No. It can't be. Mark whispered, his voice breaking, tears spilling from eyes he believed had long since dried. Miller stared at his boss in terror as Mark's body shook violently. Captain Mark. Is that someone you know, sir? Mark lifted his head. The handsome, normally cold face was now twisted in unbearable agony. His eyes were bloodshot, bulging wildly. Emily. Mark's scream tore through the space, echoing throughout the police station like the howl of a mortally wounded beast. He shoved Miller aside and lunged toward the scream, as if he could break through it and pull the child into his arms. It's her. It's my daughter. My God, what have I done? Mark clutched his left chest, where his heart felt like it was being crushed. He remembered the child's desperate gaze when he shoved her away. That look wasn't fear of the police. It was the pain of a child being rejected by her own father at the very moment she had found a flicker of hope to survive. I have to get there. I have to. Mark stammered, spinning in circles searching for an exit. His composure, his perfection, his neatly pressed suit, none of it mattered anymore. Now he was just a guilty father racing against death to atone for the most horrific mistake of his life. The roar of the sports car's V8 engine exploded like an enraged beast, ripping through the city's silent night. Mark slammed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer needle shot up to 112 miles per hour. He ran red lights, crossed lanes, cut off trucks. Every traffic law, every safety rule that exemplary Captain Mark once revered was thrown out the exhaust pipe. Wait for Daddy. Emily, please wait for Daddy. Mark muttered like a madman, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sweat poured off him, soaking his expensive dress shirt, but he didn't care. The image of the crescent-shaped scar and his daughter's desperate eyes when he shoved her away replayed endlessly in his mind like a never-ending horror film. Only 15 minutes later. The car screeched to a halt, skidding across gravel at the entrance to the alley leading into the projects. The scene before him was chaos, like a battlefield. Police lights flashed blue and red, splashing color across damp, moldy walls. A crowd of curious residents packed one corner of the alley, shouting and cursing nonstop. Mark kicked open the car door and charged out. He didn't look down. He ran straight into a pool of black sludge, sewer water splashing everywhere, staining his neatly pressed dress pants. But the man with the pathological cleanliness disorder didn't even blink. "Move aside. Everyone move aside," Mark shouted, his voice cracking with panic, using the strength of a father gone mad to force the crowd apart. The crowd parted like waves before a deranged ship's prow, not out of respect for a police captain's authority, but because they saw a man who had lost his mind. Mark charged past the yellow warning tape, his expensive Italian leather shoes sinking into the mud, black sewage splattering up his pant legs, soaking into the fine fabric. He didn't look down. His eyes were locked on the door of the Rusty Spoon. "Emily! Emily!" His cry broke apart amid the wailing sirens and the clamor of the projects. Mark burst straight into the diner. Inside was devastation. Tables and chairs were overturned. The stench of spoiled food mixed with sour sweat, forming a thick, choking air. The restaurant owner was crouched in a corner, held tightly by two officers taking his statement. When he saw Mark rush in disheveled, eyes bloodshot, the man jumped, stammering, "Sea Captain! Sir!" Mark grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off the ground. Cleanliness, personal space, disinfectant handkerchiefs, everything vanished. Mark roared, his breath blasting straight into the man's face. "Where is the girl? Where's the child who was serving tables?" The owner trembled, his face drained of all color. She ran out the back door. After you left." "But then, oh my God, say it." Mark screamed, veins bulging in his neck. "She fainted. Jack's men, when they were fleeing, they knocked her down. She wasn't moving. They carried her to the back. The ambulance just arrived." Mark released him. The owner collapsed to the floor. Mark's heart felt as if someone had reached into his chest and crushed it. He turned and ran toward the back exit. The rear area. Ambulance headlights swept across piles of scrap. A group of paramedics surrounded a stretcher placed directly on the filthy ground. Mark rushed forward, his foot catching on an empty liquor bottle. He went down hard. His entire body slammed into a pool of black, trash-filled water. Mud covered his face and hands, soaking into his $1,000 tailored suit. Mark scrambled up without a second thought. He crawled on all fours toward the stretcher, mumbling like a delirious man. "Daddy's here. Emily." David ran out from the crowd, his face smeared with grime and filled with grief. He spread his arms to block Mark, his voice choking. "Boss. Don't go over there. Captain Mark, stop. Move, David. My daughter. That's my daughter." Mark shoved David aside and staggered forward. Then he froze. On the stretcher, a stark white sheet had been pulled up, completely covering the small body lying beneath it. A paramedic was removing his gloves, shaking his head sadly at a colleague. Too late. Severe physical exhaustion, compounded by the impact. The heart had already stopped responding before we arrived. Mark's world collapsed. All the sounds around him, sirens, howling wind, the murmur of the crowd, suddenly went silent. Only a deafening buzz remained inside his head. Severe physical exhaustion. Mark looked down at his trembling hands, caked with mud. Then he looked at his shoes. The shoes he had used to bully that child. It was him. He was the one who had killed her. Not the criminals. Not poverty, but his own cruelty and arrogance. He had found his child again after 6 years of desperate searching, only to push her to her death with his own hands. He had called her trash. He had been disgusted by her. No. Mark collapsed to his knees, his kneecaps slamming hard into the jagged concrete and gravel. He threw his face up to the sky and screamed a heart-rending, desolate cry of agony so raw that the entire project seemed to shudder into silence. He crawled to the stretcher, his mud-covered hands shaking as they reached out, about to pull the white sheet down. But then he recoiled. He was afraid. Afraid to see that angelic face forever stilled. afraid to see the crescent-shaped scar gone cold. And above all, he felt unworthy. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Mark smashed his forehead into the ground, his brow hitting the mud, tears mixing with sewage water as they streamed down a face once considered flawless. "I'm an animal. I'm the trash. Emily." The image of the little girl kneeling to clean his shoes came back with knife-sharp clarity. Her desperate eyes. Her tiny hands reaching for his pant leg. "Never let those filthy hands touch me." The words echoed back, hammering into Mark's brain like 1,000 sledgehammers. He clutched his chest, coughing violently, feeling as if his lungs were being torn apart. He dry heaved, bile burning his throat, but no matter how hard he retched, he couldn't expel the pain ripping him apart from the inside. Captain Mark the legendary, the police department's clean god, was now nothing but a pathetic wreck, kneeling in a dump, sobbing beside the child he had spent his entire life searching for, only to lose her in a single moment of indifference. The paramedics exchanged pitying glances, no one daring to intervene. David stood there, turning his face away, secretly wiping his tears. No one had imagined a tragedy this devastating. Mark slumped over the edge of the stretcher, his hand gripping the cold metal rail, desperately begging for a miracle he knew would never come. Cleanliness? Career? Fame? All of it was meaningless ashes. "Get up, sweetheart. I'm begging you. Get up and dirty my clothes. Get up and smear mud all over my face." Mark's whisper shattered in the cold wind, dissolving into the endless night of belated regret. Rain began to fall. Heavy, icy drops like needles stabbing into flesh poured down over where Mark knelt. Rain mixed with sewage and mud, streaming down the face he had once groomed so carefully, but Mark felt no cold. His body was numb, and his soul lay frozen with the stopped heartbeat of his little daughter. "Please," Mark whispered, his hoarse voice breaking beneath the pounding rain. He squeezed Emily's small, cold, rough hand in his own. That hand was smeared with grease, its nails black and filthy, the very thing he had disgustedly called a source of infection just hours earlier. Now he pressed it against his cheek, hoping to transfer the last trace of warmth from his own body to hers. "I'll trade everything. My career, my wealth, even my life. Just move, sweetheart. Just once, Emily." David stood behind him, tears mingling with rain, about to step forward to help his boss up. Then he froze. A jolt of electricity ran down his spine when he saw something impossible. In the flickering beam of the ambulance headlights, the little pinky finger resting in Mark's hand twitched slightly. Mark stopped breathing. He stared down, eyes wide, terrified that it was only an illusion born of extreme despair. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was post-mortem muscle contraction. The cold, clinical logic of a forensic investigator screamed that explanation inside his head. But then it happened again. The calloused thumb, the thumb that had carved the distorted star onto the toe of his leather shoe slowly, weakly curled, brushing against Mark's palm. A trembling, fragile movement, as light as a butterfly's wing in a storm, yet to Mark it shook the world more violently than an earthquake. "Doctor!" Mark screamed, his voice tearing through the rain, frantic and unhinged. "Doctor! She's still alive." The medical team packing up jolted in shock. The elderly doctor frowned, about to explain mechanical reflexes, but when he met the wild, blazing eyes of Mark, he rushed forward instead. He pressed his stethoscope to Emily's frail chest, holding his breath. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds passed in suffocating silence, broken only by rain drumming on the plastic tarp. Then the doctor's eyes flew open behind his glasses. "There's a pulse," he shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "A very weak pulse, but it's back. Lazarus phenomenon. Move. Adrenaline. Prepare the defibrillator." The air of morning instantly exploded into frantic chaos filled with hope. Nurses rushed in, pushing Mark aside to work. "Step back. We need space," one nurse yelled. Mark was shoved backward, falling flat into a muddy puddle. Yesterday's Mark would have exploded in rage at being dirtied. Today's Mark scrambled back up, not daring to come closer for fear of interfering, yet unable to take his eyes off his daughter as she clung to life. He knelt there, hands clasped, fingernails digging deep into the mud, murmuring prayers he had forgotten since childhood. Beep, beep, beep. The sound of the heart monitor rang out. At first irregular and faint, then gradually more steady. It was the most beautiful sound Mark had ever heard in his life, sweeter than any symphony he had listened to in his luxurious penthouse. Heart rate is stabilizing. Blood pressure is rising. The doctor announced, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold rain. We've pulled her back from death. Emily stirred slightly. Her heavy eyelids, clotted with mud and rainwater, slowly fluttered open. Mark held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs as if trying to burst free. He inched closer to the stretcher, timid as a condemned man awaiting judgment. Emily, he called, his voice choking. The child's eyes drifted, clouded and confused. She saw the blinding lights, saw strangers in white coats. Instinctive fear surged. Her small body curled inward, her mouth releasing panicked, whimpering sounds. She was trying to flee the way she had learned to survive for years, hiding under bridges and in market corners. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Mark rushed forward, brushing aside the nurse's hand as she prepared a sedative. He dropped to his knees at the child's eye level. Emily looked at him. In that moment, time seemed to stop. In the child's eyes, the man before her was no longer the arrogant, clean, cold god from the diner earlier. Before her was a man soaked through, broken. His once perfectly styled hair hung limp and plastered to his forehead. His handsome face was smeared with black mud. His expensive suit was wrinkled and torn. He looked miserable. But in those bloodshot eyes overflowing with tears, Emily saw something familiar. A worn light she had thought extinguished 6 years ago, buried in feverish dreams beneath bridges and in dark market corners. Mark trembled as he raised his hand. He meant to touch his daughter's cheek, but then remembered that his hand was still covered in mud from the garbage-filled lot. He froze. The obsession with filth, not fear of being dirty himself, but fear of dirtying his child, made him pull his hand back. I'm sorry. Mark sobbed, tears streaming down, blurring the streaks of mud on his face. I don't dare touch you. Daddy is too dirty. But Emily did not pull away. The child, with the weak strength that had just returned to her, slowly reached out her thin, scarred, calloused hand. The hand Mark had once rejected. She touched Mark's face. Small, cold fingers pressed against his burning cheek. She smeared grease and dirt across her father's skin. She spread her filth onto his perfection. And Mark closed his eyes, pressing his cheek tightly into that dirty little palm, receiving it as the most sacred blessing. He kissed his daughter's palm, kissed the rough calluses, the blackened fingernails. The child struggled to move her lips. Mark broke down completely. He lunged forward, wrapping the small, filthy, soaked body tightly in his arms. He no longer cared about bacteria, mud, status, or dignity. That's right. It's Daddy. Daddy has found his star, Mark cried, his sobs mixing with the almost mad laughter of happiness. Daddy's here, Emily. I'll never lose you again. Never. Emily buried her head in her father's mud-stained chest. The expensive cologne was gone, replaced by the smell of sweat, rain, and safety. She cried, her tears finally releasing all the humiliation and pain she had endured through 6 years of earthly hell. Daddy. The small, hoarse voice finally came out whole. Mark held her tighter, feeling her small chest rise and fall, feeling warmth spread through him. Get the stretcher into the ambulance. Now. The doctor ordered. Mark did not let go of his daughter. He stood up and lifted Emily into his arms, ignoring the stretcher. He walked forward between rows of medical staff and police officers standing silently, overcome with emotion. Mark stepped through the pool of black water. His feet were bare. The handmade Italian leather shoes worth $3,000 symbols of his pride and his obsession with cleanliness had been left behind, lying abandoned, submerged in the garbage lot mud. One still bore the deep scratch of a crooked star. They lay there as proof of the death of perfect Captain Mark and the rebirth of a father. David ran after him, holding his own jacket, intending to drape it over Mark's shoulders, but Mark shook his head. He tore off his tattered suit jacket and wrapped it tightly around Emily, shielding her from the cold rain. "Let's go home, my daughter," Mark whispered into her ear as he stepped into the ambulance. "Go home. Daddy will cook soup for you. And you can spill it as many times as you like." The ambulance doors closed, hiding the image of the father and daughter clinging tightly to each other. The siren wailed as the vehicle sped off into the rainy night, but this time it was not a manhunt. It was a journey carrying the broken pieces of a family trying to mend itself, beginning with the filthiest stains, yet also the most honest and love-filled ones. The story of Captain Mark is a profound wake-up call about arrogance and prejudice. Sometimes, an obsession with outward glamour blinds us to the most precious values. Never rush to judge someone by tattered clothes, because beneath the dirt may lie the treasure we spend a lifetime searching for. Fame, wealth, or extreme cleanliness all become meaningless in the face of blood ties. Live with compassion, do not let indifference turn us into lonely souls. Only love has the power to cleanse the soul and heal every wound. How do you feel about Mark's journey of awakening? Is this late repentance enough to make up for Emily's 6 years of hell? Leave a comment below. Your empathy is the motivation that helps us continue writing stories that reach the deepest parts of the heart.